So we are in Paris, me and comrade Bruno, and in the five days we are reaching the 115th anniversary of the Comune de Paris, and we will talk about this. So let's begin.
Yes, so it's a very important event, as we know, for the socialist and the workers' movement. Of course, especially in France, and in France we will have quite a lot of celebration, even if the pandemic crisis create quite a lot of problem. But anyway, there will be quite a lot of meetings and reunions about Paris Commune, but as we know, Paris Commune was something very important, not only for France and French history, but for the whole worker movement all over the world. At the time when it happened, because it was the first attempt to create a socialist state. And even if it failed, it was an example that it was a real movement and that the fight for socialism was on the rise, and that's created a conscience that the fight for socialism is something real and not something only theoretical. And the Paris Commune is also very important for the other events. We have to remember that Lenin, after the October Revolution, was very happy the day he discovered that the Bolshevik Revolution lasted longer than the Paris Commune, because he was not very sure at the beginning of the October Revolution that the Russian Revolution will survive quite long. So we have also to take that into account, that the Paris Commune was the symbol of what can be reached, but also the symbol of what can be defeated. And of course, it's very important. And we have to remember also something that maybe was forgotten, and that is maybe something not very known, but still it shows how the Paris Commune was an event on the world scale, because of course what I will talk now about is something very peculiar, and is something that has to be of course analyzed for a completely other reason. But what I want to focus on is the fact that this event is symbolical. During the Chinese Cultural Revolution in 1967, at a certain moment of the fights in China between different Red Guards faction, you had a moment, a very short moment, but this moment is important historically speaking. It's in Shanghai. The Red Guards created the Shanghai Commune, and this didn't last very long. It also was very short as the Paris Commune, but was it very important is the fact that they created the Shanghai Commune, and they took the constitution of Paris Commune, trying to do it in Shanghai. And of course, their aims was to change all the Chinese regime and People's Republic on the base of the Paris Commune statuses. Of course, it didn't happen because it was not realized, since the Chinese government decided it was too far left for the situation in China at that moment. But the very fact that in 1967, at the other side of the planet, more than 100 years, more or less 100 years after the Paris Commune, still the idea of Paris Commune was vivid in a city like Shanghai, is something very symbolical. It means that it belongs to the history of the workers' movement, of the communist movement, and that the Paris Commune is one of the milestone, I would say, of the working class movement. So it's very important. And of course, when we talk about the international aspect of the Paris Commune, we have to take into account that the Paris Commune was not only a French movement, but in fact an international movement, not only because people all over the world, and especially at that time in Europe and in the worker movement, were very interested by what happened in Paris, but the fact that in Paris, the people who took part in Paris at the Paris Commune were not only French, but for a large part also coming from all over the Europe of that time, and especially, and it's not very astonishing, especially you had quite a lot of Poles that took part in the Paris Commune. The historian thinks that maybe up to 200 Poles took part in the Paris Commune. Of course, the best known Poles who took part in the Paris Commune was Jarosław Dąbrowski, who was a Polish revolutionary who was the chief of the armed struggle of the Paris Commune. So he was one of the leaders of the Paris Commune, and he lost his life at the end of the Paris Commune. But Jarosław Dąbrowski, of course, is both a hero of the worker movement, a hero of the Paris Commune, and a hero of the Polish socialist movement. But he's the best known Pole who took part in the Paris Commune, but he's not the only one. And it's very important if we take into account the fact that during the whole 19th century, Poles were considered by, I would say, all Europe. And when I'm talking about all Europe, I'm talking about the left of Europe, but also the right-wing Europe. So Poles were considered as, let's say, as being in the forefront of the movement against the Holy Alliance. It means against the treaty and the system that was created after the fall of the French Revolution and the fall of Napoleon. When you were talking in Paris, let's say, about Poles, you were automatically the word Pole was synonymous with revolutionary. Of course, I'm talking about that because nowadays it's maybe not always the case because the situation has changed in Poland, as you know, and so Polish society has changed also quite a lot. But it's important to remember, and it's important for Poles, but it's also important for non-Poles to remember that in the 19th century, the word Pole was synonymous as revolutionary. Of course, it was to a certain extent an exaggeration because there were quite a lot of Poles who were reactionaries. But we have to remember that because now it's the contrary. When you say Pole, you are always thinking in the world about right-wing reactionaries and so on. But of course, it's not the whole truth. But you have this cliche sometimes about some nationality at a certain moment of history. And the cliche of the 19th century was that Poles were naturally going toward a revolution. We can see that even in Karl Marx. Karl Marx, when he's speaking about Poland, is very, very positive about Poles and Polish uprising tradition and so on, even if at the end of his life he begins to think that the Poles are not so revolutionary as the growing Russian revolutionary movement is coming. And to a certain extent, we can see that at the end of his life, Marx is thinking that maybe the vanguard of revolution will be the Russians, and then the Poles will not be so revolutionary as they were earlier. But anyway, that's another question. What is very important is that the Paris Commune was the last international event in which the Poles occupied a vanguard role. I mean, the last. It doesn't mean that, of course, the Poles didn't took part in other revolutionary movement later, especially, for example, during the 1905 revolution in Russia, and to a certain extent also in the 1917 revolution in Russia, with quite a lot of Bolshevik leaders from Polish belonging. But as an image, we can say that the Paris Commune was the last moment where Poles were obviously seen as, let's say, professional revolutionaries. And even in the anti-Paris Commune propaganda, the propaganda of the Thiers government and the propaganda of the Versailles government against the Paris Commune, there was a lot of articles trying to discredit Paris Commune as a plot of foreign agents, especially Poles, that are intervening in French business and who shouldn't intervene, and that it shows that in fact Paris Commune is a movement which is not French but foreign. And the fact that Jarosław Dąbrowski and other Poles were taking part in that movement was an argument used by French nationalism, I would say, right-wing nationalism, to discredit Paris Commune. But in the fact, of course, Paris Commune is a movement which was very popular in Paris, in France, but especially in Paris, and it was the growing part of the French and the Paris society took part in the Paris Commune. And it's also very important to take that into account, that it was a very patriotic movement in France, but also internationalism. And Paris Commune is something like a synthesis of healthy patriotism and internationalism, since we have to, of course, observe that the Paris Commune began on the base that Parisian population didn't accept the capitulation to the Prussian army and the capitulation of France toward Prussia and German troops. So there is a patriotic aspect of the Paris Commune, but a patriotic aspect which is internationalistic, which is revolutionary, and who accept the fact that all people of the world are fighting for the same society, for the same liberty, for the same socialism, and so on. So Paris Commune is a very good example that internationalism and healthy, I would say, patriotism are not contradictory. And of course, the main contradiction was with the so-called Versailles government nationalism, which was, of course, a hypocritical nationalism, because on the same moment they criticized the fact that in the Paris Commune you had a lot of foreign fighters, especially Poles. In the same moment, their government was submitting to Prussia and Germany and resigning from war against the occupier of France and the aggressor of France, and of course their class interest is obvious. Then they were on the side of they preferred the Prussian army than the French revolutionary workers armed at that time. Yes, I don't know if I answered to your question.
Yes, maybe I will say a few words about why these Poles were in France, because because 200 people, it's not very big number, but the most.
And actually, it's not. At that time, it was, because people didn't emigrated so easily at that time.
Yes. But the most important thing, it was that in the Russia, the army of the Russia was the army that you can be officer only if you are the noble, and the nobles from Poland. They very often occupied the good position in the Russian army, and these people like Dąbrowski, Wróblewski, all these people, before they became revolutionaries, they were the officers of the Russian army, and they made insurrection against Russia in 1863. And why they were in Paris? Because many the insurrections of the Poles, when they fall, after they went to Paris. Before this was the Mickiewicz who tried to organize in 1950s the Legion to fight for the independence. And in the Commune, in the fight, the Comune de Paris with the government of bourgeoisie in Versailles, the French army was split, because all the officers of the French army, they collaborated with the government of bourgeoisie, and the workers from Paris, they are in the massive numbers. They have arm, but they don't have officers. And these Poles, which are officers in Paris, they say, okay, we can help you, because.
That's very important. Paris was, in fact, we can say Paris all over the 19th century, and especially between 1831 and the Paris Commune, was, I would say, the second or even the first capital of Poland, in the sense that the Polish political life was impossible in Polish Russia, and was impossible at that time in most of Poland, even the Prussian or the Austrian part of Poland also. So Paris was, in fact, the capital of Polish political organization, political movement, and it was like I would say a tradition after the 1831 uprising and after the 1863 uprising, to go to Paris and to take political asylum and to be part of the political fight from Paris, but directed, of course, back toward the direction of Poland, but not only. And that's the basic information. It means that the Poles in Paris were naturally internationalist, because they couldn't ignore the situation all over Europe. They couldn't ignore the situation in France. And in fact, in France, before the Paris Commune and all the time, they were welcome by, let's say, the left-wing movements, the radical movement, the revolutionary movement, the French Republican movements, and so on. But they were not very welcome by the bourgeoisie. In fact, the French bourgeoisie accepted these Polish people because they were forced to, because the French public opinion, and especially the Paris public opinion, was so in favor of those political asylum for Poles, that the kings, or the in the fact with Napoleon III is the emperor, couldn't refuse Poles in France. But in fact, if we look at French police archives, we can observe that the police was always surveying those Poles, was always fearing that these Poles were doing a bad job for their interest and for the interest of bourgeoisie, and they were always under very, very strict surveillance by the police and the secret police of the former French regime. So that's very important, because we see that then that there is a fundamental difference between the, let's say, French society and the relation French society had toward those foreigners, and especially those Polish foreigners, and the relation the elite and the bourgeoisie and the government and the police had toward those Poles. So in this situation, we understand that the Paris Commune was a moment where when everything became obvious and clear, because Poles took side of the Paris Commune against the bourgeoisie that was governing France. It doesn't mean that all Poles were on the side of the Paris Commune. You had some Poles that were on the side of the French government, and especially there was one Pole, and it's a pity, who was quite. Who played quite a positive role in the Polish history, even if we can discuss about that. Ludwik Mierosławski, and Ludwik Mierosławski took side of the Versailles government during the Paris Commune, and I would say he finished his life on a very negative aspect. But of course, it was not very important. The mass of Poles, as I told you, we estimate about 200, more or less, the number of Poles inside the Paris Commune that took part on the side of Paris Commune. And of course, these numbers we had to take into account that in the 19th century, we had not, at that time of the 19th century, we had not mass emigration. So the number of people going out from their country is not as important as it began at the end of 19th century, when you had the process of economical immigration. For the moment, in the 19th century, up to the Paris Commune, we have the situation of political immigration, and of course, political immigration is always less massive than economical immigration. And as you told, of course, the fact that this petty nobles, because we have also to take into account that you say that only nobles could and should even take part in the army, in the Russian army. It's one aspect of the thing, but the second aspect of the thing is that in Poland we had a very high aristocracy of very rich aristocrats, but we had also a very large number of petit nobility, of little nobles, which were in fact rather poor. They had the titles of being nobles, but they were poor, and they were quite progressive in their political opinions, because of course, if you look from the Western side, you cannot understand how noble can be on the side of revolutionary. But we have to take into account that quite a lot of noble had even no land. They had the title, they inherited from their ancestor the title of nobles, but they were not at all on the side of rich people. And especially at the end of the 19th century and at the middle, in fact, of the 19th century, when capitalism became to grow and to develop even in Poland, the little nobles, the little nobility began to lose the land they had because of competition, of economical competition, and you had quite a lot of impoverished nobles that I know that had no perspective to live than the army. And that's the reason why you had quite a lot of them going in the army. Exactly the same situation we have now, for example, in the United States, why you have so many black people going in the United States Army. It's not because they are supporting the American imperialism. It's only because black or Chicano, I mean Mexican people, go in the army because it's the only institution they can have work, they can feed their family, and even they can eventually had education paid. So they go there, and of course that's why also you have quite a lot of US people, combatants coming back from, let's say, from Iraq or from different countries that are on the side of anti-war movement when they come back home. But because of course they understand that the army is on the side of the oppressors and not on the sides of the liberation movement, and that's why it's the same situation in the 19th century Poland. I mean, so if Jarosław Dąbrowski went to the army, he didn't went to the Russian army. He didn't went to the Russian army because he was a lover of the Tsar. He went to the Russian army because it was the only solution for him to let's say learn something and be prepared for life. But in his mind, he understood what was the system based on, and that's the reason why he was naturally a revolutionary during the 1863 uprising, and automatically it led him toward the Paris Commune. And he was not the only one. It was something that was very frequent. And we have to take also that into account. It's not because somebody is going to an institution that formally is an oppressive institution that he cannot change his mind, or that he's not aware of the process he's taking part in. But the army is something very let's say very we have to be very intelligent when we think about the army, because the whole history of quite a lot of military in their history shows that people going to the army, to a very reactionary army, can become very progressive. I talk about the American movement, but it's the same with Chavez in Venezuela. It's the same with Nasser in Egypt, or Gaddafi in Libya. And in a certain extent, we can say that Jarosław Dąbrowski is the father of all this tradition of people who understood rather that what is the role of an army, and on which side people have to stand when people are rebelling. What's the case in the Paris Commune? So it's very important what you said, and to make people conscious of the contradiction functioning really in the society.
I think that this question, the people from other nations in the army, it is very interesting, because we have example of the Poles in the Russian army, which are after revolutionaries, but we have also example that the people from other nations are the people, the most reactionaries. We have example of the civil war in Spain, when the Franco started his rebellion, not with the Spain soldiers, but with the Moroccan soldiers. And also in the history of the Russian Revolution, the Cossack, they are the most reactionary force which existed in Russia. And they this is something which I don't understand in all my life. Why this Cossack was such reactionary. But I want also to say something about this Mirosławski, because for people who don't know his history, it is not. It is very important guy to history of Poland. He participated in 4 uprising. He was the member of the uprising in 1930. He was very young. He participated in. He wanted to make the uprising in 1846 in Wielkopolska against Prussia, and after he was liberated. Yes, and he was arrested, and after he was liberated in the time of the Spring of the Nations in 1948. So it is in 1948. It was his 3rd uprising, and also he in the time of the uprising in 1863, he was designed to be the dictator of this insurrection. So it is one of the most famous revolutionary of the Poles. But in the when he was old, he
took the wrong side.
yes. But I also want to say something about these relations between Poland and France. When Sarkozy was in the Polish parliament, he started his speech that the Poland is the it is the only nation in Europe which France didn't have a war. In all history, that
was never at war with Poland.
Yes, that France have the war with all the Europe countries, but not with Poles. And it's true, because these relations that we are also the alliance anti-German, it's long history. But we have to take to account that in 19th century the French are using Poles for useful idiots. We have this example of the Napoleon, who used the Poles to fight in Spain and in many countries, but not to liberation Poland. He sent these Poles to Haiti, and the Poles in Spain made many stuff very ugly. But in the mentality of the Poles in 19th century was also always they thinking that France is our friend, and the friend. And in the French bourgeoisie, in the French army, they are always was a fraction who thought that maybe we can use Poles. They try, for example, use the Poles in the war with Russia in 1853. The most famous Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz, he started to organize this legion to fight with them, but they cynically use Poles and only to we have in the diplomatic relation with Russia. We have Poles, so you have to make a diplomatic how to say
compromises.
Yes, because if not, we can use Poles against you, and these Poles will organize uprising in Russia.
And that's why, the relation between France and Poles were always very ambiguous, because, as you say, France state used Poles to its own purpose, and only Poles were seeing France as a myth. And this myth, in fact, last only in 1939 with the Second World War, when Poland was attacked and was not helped by France. But up till that time, France was the myth of France as an ally of Poland, and was always very strong. But as I told earlier, in the same time, French bourgeoisie was very aware that the Poles were potentially revolutionaries. So Poles living in France after the different insurrection, the different uprising, had always quite tough times, because they were always under police surveillance. And it's an aspect of the French history. People people don't want to talk about the situation of Polish immigrants in France, Polish political immigrants in France, was not very funny all the time. They had quite a lot of material difficulty, which were created by the French authorities, and they had the difficult it was difficult for them to organize politically in France. And on that side, Paris Commune is very important, because at that moment things became clear-cut. It was obvious then, it was the first time, in fact, that a mass of Poles took side against the French government, against the French elite, against the French bourgeoisie, and not only took side, but took an important role inside this fight. And it's the beginning of the end of the Polish political immigration to France. After the Paris Commune, of course, France began to be an immigration country for Poles, but for economical immigration, Poles coming to France to work in the minings of the northern France. But it was the end of the Polish political immigration. After 1871, it means after the fall of Paris Commune, Paris was not anymore, as I said earlier, the political capital of Poland. Poles were going in other countries, in Belgium, in England, in United States for political reason, and especially some Poles went back to Poland, because at that time Austria gave some liberties to Poles, and it was it became, after the Paris Commune, even easier to politically work in Poland, in Krakow, than in Paris, because there were more liberty for Poles in Krakow at the end of the 19th century than it was in Paris. So the French Commune was the last moment of the Paris as a star for the Poles. It was the beginning of some realism, maybe not for all Poles, but at least for Polish revolutionaries who understood that the French bourgeoisie and the French government was just cynical toward Poland. So the Paris Commune was a very important moment for the development of the political consciousness of Poles, and especially, of course, of Polish left and Polish socialist movement, because they discovered, in a way they didn't earlier, they discovered the cynicism of French bourgeoisie. That was obvious earlier, because, as you say, when Napoleon sent Poles to fight against the revolution in Haiti, it was something completely cynical. But still, the legend of Napoleon and the legend of France didn't disappear in the Polish, let's say, progressive circles. And it took only the Paris Commune to convince them that the French bourgeoisie, even under a republican, so-called republican flag, was just a cynical bunch of exploiters and cynics.
Yes, I want also say something about the Semaine Sanglante, in the week of the terror, and the last week of the Comune de Paris, when the French soldiers, when they go in the Paris, everybody who they thinking that he is worker, he was killed or arrested, but also everybody who speak Polish language was killed. It was the extermination in the base of the nation.
Because potentially Poles were seen as foreign, as potential, as revolutionaries. But and of course it was also because as I told you, all the propaganda of the Versailles government was directed against Poles because as we know, Paris Commune has some effect in French regions out of Paris, especially in Marseille. But basically, the French province, the peripheral region of France, didn't really know what was happening in Paris and didn't understand what was happening in Paris. So, of course, the French bourgeoisie is a minority. The French bourgeoisie, wanting to fight against the Paris Commune, had to find arguments that could convince, at least partly, convince the basis of the French society, means people from the countryside and workers out of Paris. They couldn't, of course, use the argument of the bourgeoisie, the argument of capitalism, the argument of the system. So they tried to use the argument of nationalism, and they tried to pretend that the Paris Commune was a bunch of traitors and foreign agents destroying the French national unity. Of course, it was very cynical because at that time, as I told you, French government was collaborating with the Prussian occupation army. And if we have to talk about traitors, the Versailles government was a pure government of traitors, but the propaganda was based on xenophobic and even racist, we would say, propaganda, and Poles were the symbol of this propaganda. So, of course, as soon as French army, official French government army arrived in Paris, they were indoctrinated that they are fighting against a bunch of bandits and foreign agents, especially Poles. So they were fanatically educated on that direction, and this explains why they were killing all Poles, since it was it gave them the impression they were fighting against the enemy of France. And that's, of course, a national tragedy in France, because when we take into account the fact that these French soldiers coming into Paris were killing people, they didn't know exactly who they were and what they were fighting for, because they were politically uneducated, and in a sense we can say they used French peasant. Mostly peasant, because France was at that time mostly a rural country, so they used French peasants against their own interests, exactly the same way Napoleon used the Poles in Spain or in Haiti against their own interests. And Paris Commune is a very important event for that aspect, because it shows that it is quite easy to use people against their own interests. And Paris Commune is the exact counterexample of that, because in Paris Commune, for the first time in a so massive way in Paris, we had a very strong proletarian, conscious, educated, politically educated movement. And it shows that the liberation of the class liberation needs to go along with political education, philosophical education, and the brightness, I would say, of the Paris Commune is the fact that it was on the first time we had a so massive movement of people coming from the working class that were so politically aware of the situation, so politically educated. So that's why, even if Paris Commune was a defeat, this defeat was not a complete defeat, because what workers learned during Paris Commune, it was very important for them in France, even for, especially of course for the ones who survived, even if they were deported very far away from France. Quite a lot of people were deported to New Caledonia. It means an island in the Pacific Ocean, very, very far. But anyway, they learned a lot politically, and of course the Paris Commune was I would say, an open university of political education for all the worker movement. It's not, it's not strange that Karl Marx took Paris Commune as the founding moment of the concrete realization of socialism. The first moment when an attempt, a practical attempt to create something going in the direction of socialism was done. And it is not also astonishing when we understand that Lenin, when he organized the Bolshevik Revolution, took into account the Paris Commune, and for the beginning, at least, of the Bolshevik Revolution, he compared all the time the Russian situation, the situation he was leading, with the Paris Commune situation.
Okay, now I want to make other subject. It is subject about the revolution and the army, because when we watch the history of the French workers' movement, we see that when workers made uprising before this, for example, in 1848, it was easy to defeat these workers. And I think that this possibility for existing the socialist state in Paris was because these workers was before they started, they were soldiers. They were soldiers to defend Paris. The bourgeoisie give them the weapons, and after they started to make the revolution. And when we in the history of the socialist movement, we have many examples when the revolution was made by the soldiers. We have the example of the Russian Revolution in 1917, especially of the February Revolution, but also the October Revolution. We have the examples of the many movement in the Third World. We have the Thomas Sankara, we have the Gaddafi. It is, we can discuss.
Still, at the beginning, it's obviously socialist.
Yes. We have Chavez, and so very often we see that somebody who is in the army, he began his career like reactionary. For example, Chavez, when he was young, he was killing the revolutionaries in Venezuela, and after he became revolutionary. And my question for you, it's the question for the future, because when we see the army of the United States in the capitalist countries, we have these relations that in the army, it is the poorest people who go to army. Do you think that it is possible that these poor people from the working class, from the black community or Mexican community, it is possible that one time they will make rebellion against the deep state or the government American?
If you look, for example, at the anti-war movement now in the United States, most of the anti-war movements are under the leadership of people who were in the army, who went back from Iraq, from different Somalia and so on, Afghanistan, and who, when they went back home, began to be engaged in this anti-war movement. Of course, it's an anti-war movement based on former militaries and not on militaries. But even if the fact that they began to be aware of the situation inside the army, because it's inside. When they were at the army, they understood where, on which side they were fighting for, and then when they went back home, they cut their ties with the army and they engaged in the anti-war movement. It's of course something which is showing that inside their army there is something happening. So I don't eliminate the possibility that some days the American military's, let's say, the grassroots soldier will rebel, as they were earlier in the Russian Revolution, in the Paris Commune, and so on, or in the Egypt of the 50s. This is possible. Of course, the situation is a little bit different now because of technical reason, because you have different armies. You have the technical centers, the military technical centers, which are organizing, for example, the drone bombings in Arizona, and they bomb in Iraq or in Afghanistan and so on. And it's difficult to imagine that these informaticians working, bombing in Afghanistan, but sitting in a good place in Arizona will rebel. Even if observing what's happening in the United States, we had quite a lot, very important, in fact, a lot of those informaticians working for the bombing of different places of the world have a nervous depression. And are very depressive, and for the American army it's a very big problem, since quite a lot of them, too much of them for the army, are having a nervous problem, because it's of course a problem with their consciousness. So maybe someday they will rebel also. But basically, of course, the question will be, do the average soldiers will rebel some days? Of course, some elements show us it's possible. In France, for example, I'm a member of an organization, an anti-militarist organization, which was founded in 1917. In 1917, the same year as the Russian Revolution. It's an anti-militaristic association that was created by soldiers at that time, and that was fighting against the war. And it was the organization that was on the base of the creation later of the French Communist Party. So I'm a member of this organization, and this organization is basically an organization of former soldiers, even if it's not only a soldier organization. I'm not a soldier. I'm there like a lot of militants. And what is very important, what is very interesting is the fact that among members, we have some pilots of the French Air Force who were bombing Yugoslavia, and who discovered during that war that they were on the wrong side. And when they became aware of that, they understood they were used. They were used for purpose that had nothing to do with democracy. But what is important is the fact that the beginning of their process of being conscious is a mixture of two things. The fact that their living conditions were going lower and lower, and not better and better. So they had their, let's say, professional and personal situation that make them aware that the army is using them cynically, and then exploiting them. And this was mixed with the fact that they discovered that that war was not really a war for democracy and human rights. You know, they changed side, I would say. Of course, it's an individual question, because Yugoslav war was not a mass war. So what I'm talking about some people. It's individual case. It's not a mass case. It couldn't be a mass case because it was not a mass war. But anyway, it shows that everything is possible. And I'm talking about pilots. I'm talking about people who are educated, because you're not pilot in 5 minutes. Huh? You are a pilot because you have a long training and education before. So all that didn't change them, but the war did change them. It makes me relatively optimistic about the question you are asking for, and of course the same thing with the Paris Commune, because this, well, as you told, these 200 Poles taking part in the Paris Commune were most of them coming from the army earlier, and from the Russian army they went on the Polish uprising movement in 1863, and later they arrived in Paris and took side of the Paris Commune. So it's a very long road to become a revolutionary. It's you know, the revolutionary is not somebody who at the age of 18 say, oh, I will become a revolutionary. Sometimes it happens, of course, but most of the time it takes half of a life to understand what is the situation, especially when you are coming from working class and popular background, especially when you are coming from lower classes from the province, from the from area far from centers. But it's very important to understand that we are talking about Chavez, Sankara, and so on. Those people were mostly coming from not the working class of big city, but they were coming from the remote areas of their country. So they had no chance to understand what is political life, what is the political system, what they are working for, what they are fighting for, and you know, they cannot understand things in one night. It's only the confrontation with reality that makes them aware. I don't know if you heard about, it's very, very sad, but also very important, the testimony of the man who killed Che Guevara. It's very important because he was a peasant. And of course, he was in the Bolivian army, and of course, he was fighting as his chiefs told him. And he was the one who executed Che Guevara. And he was a little bit impressed by Che Guevara before he killed him, but still, it took him years to understand that Che Guevara was fighting on the side of his class. And at the end of his life, when he lost eyes, he was cured by Cuban doctors in Bolivia, because Cuban doctor arrived in Bolivia. And then he suddenly understood that Che Guevara came from Cuba, and that the Cubans are helping the Bolivian people, and that he was on the wrong side of the fight. And what is very important, he had the courage to tell the truth and to have an interview with Cuban press. And when he described that Che Guevara was the good one and he was the bad one, you know, it's humanly very, very strong. But we have to understand this man was not conscious what he was doing most of his life. but still he's a hero because he understood at the very end what was happening, and he had the courage to recognize that what he did was very dirty. And it, you know, it's difficult to recognize I was a killer. I was on the wrong side. I was a bad man. But you have to understand, I mean, he was a peasant from, you know, backward areas. And that's exactly the same during the Paris Commune. The Thiers government, the Versailles government, the bourgeois government used peasants from deep France. Telling, you know, in Paris, it's the completely, it's a city of corrupted people, of immoral people, of sexual perversities, and so on and so on and so on. And of course, you have to understand that a Frenchman coming from a remote village in the central of France, which was educated by priests and religion and traditionalism, about what is good and what is wrong, and Puritanism, and so on and so on. He was looking at Paris as a bunch of sexual perverse people mixed with foreigners, and so on and so on. And you cannot ask him, be aware that you are on the wrong side and you are on the side of the bourgeoisie. I mean, it takes time to make those people
yes, but Bruno, I want to ask you, do you think that the Comune de Paris make the mistakes about the anti-clericalism, which was in the time of that if they not attacked church, only the bourgeoisie, if they nationalize the bank, and first fight with the bourgeoisie, and after with religion, with Catholic Church, the situation could be better?
You know, it's a very the issue you're talking about is a very important one, because it's a very difficult one. Because of course, what you are telling is, rationally speaking, something that we have to take into account. And we have to take into account that a lot of religious people are, that the mass of the religious people are people which are, let's say, maybe politically unaware of the situation, but basically who have some, let's say, positive moral attitude toward different things. But in the same time, we must understand, especially in France and especially in Paris, that the hate against church was not decided upstairs. I mean, people hated these institutions because the hypocrisy of bishops, the hypocrisy of a lot of priests was so obvious that they had hate against that. And you cannot ignore the fact that in Paris, people, quite a lot of people in Paris was aware what the real church was based on. Of course, not in remote village of deep France, but in Paris, they observed the hypocrisy of the higher hierarchy of the church, you know, you must take hate as an objective fact. I mean, people do hate for some reason something, and when they hate, they behave with that hate. So I think it would be, you are right to a certain extent, but it's theoretical. Practically, it was the same during the Russian Revolution. Of course, objectively, we can say, oh, why here or there the Red Army did burn such a beautiful church. It's an art building and you have not to destroy it. Of course, rationally speaking, that's okay. But, and it's a pity that this church was burned, for example, of course. But you have to take into account that people have a hate that is coming from, not only from them, it's coming from generations. You know, French Catholic tradition I don't say that every Catholic is bad. I don't say that you have not even holy persons in the church that were very respectful intellectually, morally, and so on. But basically, we have to take into account that church in France is the church of religious war. Paris Commune, for example, the relation of Paris Commune toward church and the relation earlier we had during the French Revolution towards church is the fruit of hundreds of years of religious wars, of systematic repression, of torture, of things on political and social level, and things on personal level, because the priests in every, not all the priests, but a lot of priests in a lot of villages were taking advantage of young girls or young boys. What we call pedophilia now. Of course, it was not official, but it was a reality that was coming from generation to generation, from generation to generation. And for a long time, people said, oh, it's the exception. Church is good, but this priest is bad. But at the very end, after 200 years, 300 years, 400 years of this regime, you understand it's a system. It's not only the bad man here or this bad man there. It's a system. So when French people, and especially in big cities where people could discuss more easily, because in a village it's very difficult to discuss about those things because everybody knows everybody and people are mutually controlling themselves. But when you arrive in big cities and you arrive in Paris, you begin to discuss and say, you know, in my village I saw that. Oh yeah, I saw that in my village too, and in that village also, and in that village, and it creates anti-clericalism. And then the hate is bursting, and you cannot ask people that have hate, because in fact they are revenging all generations, all previous generations of all what they had to bear, and they had to bear and not to talk about it, because it was impossible, because you had the church terror. So to ask them, you know, rationally speaking, this bishop is a perverted man, but you have to respect him because, you know, the French peasant in the deep France will not understand what you are doing in Paris. It's pure theory. In practice, I mean, you cannot ask people who have in their back 100 years of oppression to behave, you know, be quiet, be zen, be soft, and don't take into account your hate. You have this hate, and it's an objective element of the political fight at that moment. And that's the same reason. I mean, during the Russian Revolution or during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, how so many people destroyed churches, Buddha, temples, and so on. Because that hate is coming from something. Of course, Lenin said we have to protect the art buildings and museums, like Chuen Lai did in China during the Cultural Revolution. We have to protect the Forbidden City and the most important temples because it's culture. But in the same time, you have the hate of the masses that is coming back from down people. I had a conversation not very long ago with one colleague teaching Tibetan. You know how Tibet is used by the propaganda.
Yes.
And he told me, you know, they always will tell you that in Tibet during the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese destroyed monasteries, the Chinese destroyed this and this and this. But they never tell you that it's the Tibetan peasant who did that, not Chinese, because the Tibetan peasants that were coming from slavery, they had hate for that. And they were not thinking, oh, it's an artistical building, I will respect him. I mean, they had that hate against those monks, and they burned that monastery, but they say no propaganda, American propaganda will ever tell you that it's the Tibetan peasants and the Tibetan young Red Guards that did that, not Chinese coming from Peking. The hate was local. Of course, some Tibetan were on the other side, but you know, anti-religious feelings are often bursting, not for philosophical reason. They are bursting because religious structures at a certain moment of history are oppressive, concretely oppressive, socially oppressive, and in the same time, they are hypocritical because, of course, they always do that in the name not only of God, but they do that in the name of the beauty, of goodness, and so on. And that hypocritical aspect is even much worse than the strict oppression, because it makes you feel guilty when you rebel against them. And you have to be very strong to understand that the rebellion against them is not, you have not to be guilty, because that's bad people. That's bad people, and that's all. That's it. So I would say what they did during the Paris Commune, you can regret it when you are talking, you know, in a cafe shop. But revolution is not, as Mao Zedong said, revolution is not a gala meeting. Revolution, it's not a party, a nice party. Revolution, it's an act of violence. But it's an act of violence reacting to 100 years of violence. So I would say rather that the Paris Commune was very moderate, because still they were quite moderate in the way they behaved toward bankers, toward rich districts, and so on. I would say rather that if you take into account the violence of the moment, Paris Commune was very humanistic. You have to take that, you know, to that that into account. Of course, for the bourgeoisie, it's always terrible. But when yellow vests go in the street for the bourgeoisie, it's terrible. They were not violent, but still. They were described as a bunch of violent people and so on. What in France they call, it's of course now it's not used, but in the 19th century it was used, les classes dangereuses, the dangerous classes. That was the way people of the bourgeoisie were talking about lower classes, les classes dangereuses. Why dangerous? Dangerous. Who is dangerous for the life of humanity? The lower classes or upper classes? Who organize war? Who repress people? Always the bourgeoisie, but they are not dangerous. Or they're supposed not to be dangerous. The dangerous is the lower classes who works for them.
Thank you, Bruno. You started different subjects.
Yeah,
very interesting and very motivating to act. I only want to say that in the Hollywood movies about the Tibet, the peasants are always the friends of the monk.
Yeah, so, of course. And the Chinese are coming, and you don't understand why they're so bad in a country which is not there, supposedly.
Yeah. So thank you, because my wife said me that I have to finish, but with the Paris Commune, long anniversary.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.